Deep beneath a residential street in Paola, Malta, there is a room that scientists have spent years trying to understand. It was carved from limestone approximately 5,000 years ago, before metal tools existed in this part of the world. When researchers from the Acoustics Institute of Malta and the University of Salento measured the sound environment inside this room, they found something that the builders could not have known to engineer, or perhaps did know, in ways we cannot yet fully account for. The chamber resonates at a frequency of 110 Hz. That specific frequency, confirmed in peer-reviewed research, has measurable effects on the human brain. It suppresses activity in the left hemisphere, the analytical, language processing side, and increases activity in the right hemisphere, associated with emotional processing, creativity, and altered states. The people buried in the Hal Saflieni Hypogeum over more than 1,000 years may have been laid to rest in a space specifically designed to produce a neurological effect on those who gathered there. Based on archaeological excavation and acoustic research, this is the story of the Hypogeum, one of the oldest and most unusual underground structures in the world. In 1902, construction workers laying foundations for a new building in the town of Paola in central Malta broke through the ceiling of something they did not expect. The rubble they had been cutting through gave way to open space, and below that, more space, carved and shaped, extending downward into the limestone in a way that was clearly not natural. Work stopped. The authorities were called. What had been found was a multi-level underground complex that had been sealed, apparently for thousands of years, beneath the ordinary surface of a small Mediterranean town. The site was named the Hypogeum of Hal Saflieni, Hypogeum being the Greek term for an underground chamber, Hal Saflieni being the name of the neighborhood. Archaeological investigation revealed a structure carved across 3 descending levels, reaching approximately 10 meters below the surface at its deepest point. The carving had been done in the same soft coralline limestone that underlies much of Malta, using stone and antler tools. The site predates the use of metal in Malta by several centuries. The chambers, corridors, and connecting passages were not the work of a brief period, but of sustained construction and expansion over a span of approximately 1,000 years, from roughly 4,000 to 2,500 BC. What stopped the initial investigators in their tracks was not the scale of the carving, but what it contained. The Hypogeum had been used as a collective burial site on a substantial scale. Human remains were found throughout the lower levels, and when the excavations were complete, the bone assemblage was estimated to represent approximately 7,000 individuals. People buried here over the long period of the site's active use, their remains accumulating in the chambers and alcoves of the underground complex. The excavation was conducted by Father Emmanuel Magri, beginning in 1903, and later by Themistocles Zammit, who became one of Malta's most important early archaeologists. The documentation from this period was not as systematic as modern standards would require, and some contextual information about the original arrangement of human remains and associated objects was lost in the process. What was recovered included pottery, small figurines, and personal ornaments that provided evidence of the culture that used the site, and one object that became among the most famous prehistoric artifacts in Europe. The architectural achievement of the Hal Saflieni Hypogeum becomes fully apparent only when its construction timeline is understood. The earliest phases of carving date to the Gantesia phase of Maltese prehistory, beginning around 3,600 BC, the same period during which the surface temple complexes of Gantesia, Hagar Kim, and Menidra were being built. The tools available to the builders were made of stone, bone, and antler. No metal had yet been introduced to the island. The approximately 2,000 cubic meters of limestone removed to create the Hypogeum's chambers was extracted and shaped entirely by hand, using implements that the builders themselves had to manufacture before they could begin. What makes the Hypogeum remarkable beyond its scale is that it does not simply hollow out the rock, it replicates, underground, the architectural language of the surface temples. The upper level contains features that mirror the trilithon doorways, two upright stones supporting a horizontal lintel found at the above-ground temples. The middle level includes a corbelled ceiling in the main hall that echoes the roof construction of the surface structures. Carved pilasters and false doorways appear on the walls of several chambers. The Hypogeum is not just a functional burial space, it is a constructed underground world whose visual vocabulary references the sacred architecture of the world above. The middle level is the most elaborate and is believed to have been the most ritually significant. It includes the largest chamber, known as the main hall, with its corbelled ceiling and red ochre paintings on the walls and ceiling, geometric designs, and a trefoil pattern that recur in Maltese prehistoric art. It includes a small, almost inaccessible room at the back, whose function is debated. And it includes the oracle chamber, the room at the center of the acoustic research that has attracted international attention since the 1990s. The lower level is the deepest and least well understood. Partially flooded at times, with irregular chambers that appear to have served primarily for the deposition of human remains, it is physically more difficult to access and less well documented than the levels above it. It likely represents the earliest phase of the site's use, when the excavation was closer to the surface. The room called the oracle chamber is a small niche off one of the main corridors of the Hypogeum's middle level, roughly 3 meters long, 1 meter wide, and slightly more than a meter high. It is not a large space. What distinguishes it architecturally is a deep, ovoid recess carved into one of the short walls, roughly half a meter across and of uncertain depth, positioned approximately at head height for a person standing or kneeling in the chamber. The acoustic properties of this room were noted informally by early visitors. There are records of guides demonstrating to tourists that sounds produced in the oracle chamber reverberate through the Hypogeum in unusual ways. But systematic scientific measurement did not occur until the work of Linda Enex of the OTS Foundation for Archaeoacoustics Research, in collaboration with researchers from the University of Salento in Italy, published in 2012 in the journal Acoustics in Ancient Theatres. The measurement findings were specific and reproducible. The oracle chamber resonates at a fundamental frequency of approximately 110 Hz, a low male vocal range roughly corresponding to a bass voice singing a specific pitch. At this frequency, sound produced in the chamber reverberates strongly, persists longer than at other frequencies, and, according to acoustic modeling, would have been audible throughout much of the Hypogeum's middle level from a source in this one small room. A single voice or instrument producing sound at 110 Hz in the oracle chamber would fill the connected spaces with resonant sound in a way that other frequencies would not. The recess in the wall, whose shape and depth are optimized for low-frequency resonance, appears to have been deliberately designed to enhance this specific acoustic effect. Whether the builders understood what they were creating in physical terms, or whether they discovered through trial and error that this particular shape in this particular location produced a desired sonic experience, the design is not accidental. The neurological significance of 110 Hz as a resonant frequency was not established by the archaeoacoustic research at the Hypogeum. It came from a different line of investigation: electroencephalographic studies of human brain activity in response to different auditory stimuli. Research published by Ian Cook and colleagues at the UCLA Neuropsychiatric Institute, with results presented in relation to the Hypogeum findings by Enex and other researchers, found that sound at 110 Hz produced a measurable shift in human brain activity. Specifically, it appeared to suppress activity in the left prefrontal cortex, the region most associated with analytical thinking, language processing, and logical reasoning, while activity in the right prefrontal cortex, associated with emotional processing, intuitive thinking, and states described in the literature as related to trance or altered consciousness, remained active or increased. This finding does not mean that 110 Hz sound produces dramatic psychological effects in everyone who hears it. The effect is measured in brainwave patterns and represents a shift in the balance of neural activity, not a loss of consciousness or a pharmacological scale alteration of perception. But in the context of a ritual space, where the intent is to facilitate a specific psychological state, receptivity, reduced analytical resistance, heightened emotional or spiritual engagement, the acoustic properties of the oracle chamber would have been functional in producing those conditions. The EEG research and the archaeoacoustic research are separate bodies of work, and the connection between them is inferential. The chamber resonates at 110 Hz. That frequency has been shown to shift brain activity in a specific direction. Therefore, the chamber may have been designed to produce that neurological effect in ritual participants. This chain of inference is scientifically plausible and has been presented in peer-reviewed contexts. It does not prove that the Neolithic builders of Malta understood neuroacoustics. It does suggest that whatever they understood about the effects of sound in enclosed spaces, their construction achieved something measurable and reproducible. Visitor accounts of the Hypogeum have included descriptions of unusual sensory experiences since the site opened to the public in the early 20th century. The combination of factors present in the underground environment, near total darkness when artificial lighting is removed, the subterranean acoustic properties that make sounds carry in unexpected ways, the physical awareness of being surrounded by the carved remains of a burial space used for thousands of years, creates conditions that are psychologically distinctive even before the specific resonant properties of the oracle chamber are considered. Reports from visitors include descriptions of heightened emotional sensitivity, a sense of presence that some describe as spiritual and others as simply disorienting, and in some cases, experiences of anxiety that led to early departure from the site. Heritage Malta, which manages the Hypogeum, limits daily visitor numbers to approximately 80 people and restricts visit duration. These restrictions exist primarily for conservation reasons. Human respiration and body heat raise the humidity in the enclosed space, which accelerates the deterioration of the limestone surfaces and the red ochre paintings. But the limitation also means that the acoustic environment is not overwhelmed by the noise of large tour groups, preserving the qualities that make the space unusual. The specific claims of psychological destabilization circulating in popular accounts of the Hypogeum, that visitors lose their sense of direction, that the acoustic properties of deeper chambers can cause nausea or disorientation, should be distinguished from the peer-reviewed findings about 110 Hz resonance. The peer-reviewed research documents a specific frequency resonance with specific measurable neurological correlates. The popular claims go considerably further and are not confirmed in the scientific literature. The Hypogeum is unusual and somewhat unsettling as a physical environment. It is not a neurological hazard. Among the artifacts recovered from the Hypogeum during excavation, one has become the most famous prehistoric object from Malta and one of the most reproduced prehistoric figurines in the world. Found in the lower level of the Hypogeum, it depicts a reclining human figure, the body full and rounded, the posture deeply relaxed, the head resting on one arm in a position of sleep or profound rest. It is known as the Sleeping Lady, or the Sleeping Woman of Malta, and it is now displayed in the National Museum of Archaeology in Valletta. The Sleeping Lady is made from terracotta, fired clay, and is approximately 12 centimeters long. The surface is smooth, and the modeling of the figure is accomplished, the proportions deliberate rather than accidental, the pose specifically chosen. The figure has been interpreted variously as a representation of the dead, a deity of sleep or dreams, a depiction of the incubation ritual, the practice of sleeping in a sacred place to receive divine visions, or a priestess engaged in trance. All of these interpretations are consistent with the physical object and with what is known about the context in which it was found, and none can be confirmed over the others with the available evidence. The Hypogeum also contained approximately 7,000 individuals, representing the accumulated burials of a community over roughly 1,000 years. The manner of burial was not individual inhumation, as practiced in many cultures. The bodies were not each given a dedicated grave. Instead, the remains were deposited collectively, with earlier deposits disturbed and rearranged as new ones were added. This collective burial practice suggests a community-oriented rather than individual-oriented relationship to death and the afterlife, consistent with the communal social organization implied by the construction and maintenance of a shared underground sacred space. The association between the Hypogeum, its acoustic properties, and the management of death is one of the more intriguing aspects of the site. If the oracle chamber's resonance was used in ritual practice, some of those rituals may have been specifically concerned with the transition between the living and the dead. The 7,000 people whose remains filled the lower chambers being in some sense the audience for, or the purpose of, the ceremonies conducted in the resonant upper rooms. Malta has a long tradition of stories about underground passages connecting different parts of the island, tunnels beneath the sea linking Malta to Gozo, secret passages under Valletta, underground chambers accessible from wells and basements. Most of these stories are folk traditions without documented physical basis, and they circulate in the way that underground tunnel legends circulate in many cultures, as explanations for why things disappeared, as inherited memories of actual underground structures misremembered or embellished, or simply as the universal human fascination with the hidden world beneath the surface. The most specific folklore associated with the Hypogeum involves the claimed disappearance of a schoolteacher and her students, who allegedly entered an unexplored passage in the Hypogeum and were never seen again. This story, versions of which appear in popular accounts of the site and on Malta-focused websites, is not supported by any documented historical record. No missing persons reports corresponding to such an event have been identified in official records. Heritage Malta and Maltese historical authorities have stated that no such disappearance is documented. The story appears to be folklore, perhaps combining the real underground complexity of the site with the general category of stories about people lost in caves or tunnels. What is true is that the Hypogeum contains passages and chambers that were not fully accessible during the early excavations, and whose complete extent was not established at that time. LiDAR mapping of the site and modern survey methods have provided a more complete picture of the underground volume, but the site is not a completely explored system. There are areas that were sealed by rockfall or deliberate filling that have not been excavated. The possibility that additional chambers or passages exist beyond the currently accessible extent cannot be definitively ruled out. That genuine uncertainty is probably the kernel of truth inside the tunnel legend. The archaeoacoustic investigation of the Hypogeum represents one of the more rigorous examples of the emerging field of archaeoacoustics, the study of acoustic properties at ancient sites and their possible ritual or architectural significance. The field has grown substantially since the 1990s, driven both by the development of better acoustic measurement technology and by an increased willingness in archaeology to consider sensory experience as an intentional dimension of ancient site design. Beyond the Hypogeum, acoustically significant properties have been documented at other prehistoric sites, including Lascaux Cave in France, Stonehenge, Newgrange in Ireland, and multiple megalithic sites across Europe. The pattern is consistent enough that researchers including Rupert Till of the University of Huddersfield and Stephen Waller have argued for intentional acoustic design as a feature of prehistoric sacred spaces across a wide geographic and temporal range. The evidence varies in quality from site to site, and the field is not without controversy. The challenge of distinguishing intentional acoustic design from architectural coincidence is genuine and has not been fully resolved. The replication question is one that Enix and collaborators have addressed directly. Acoustic measurements in spaces with geometries similar to the oracle chamber have confirmed that the 110 Hz resonance is a reproducible consequence of the chamber's specific shape and dimensions, rather than a site-specific anomaly. Laboratory reconstructions of the oracle chamber's geometry at reduced scale have confirmed the resonant properties. This replicability strengthens the argument that the acoustic effect is a genuine property of the architectural design, rather than a measurement artifact. What remains harder to establish is the intentionality, whether the Neolithic builders created the 110 Hz resonance deliberately or stumbled onto it through trial and error while pursuing goals they understood in completely different terms. The honest answer is that we do not know, and probably cannot know without a written record of their intentions that does not exist. The Hal Saflieni Hypogeum presents conservation challenges that are more acute than those facing most other prehistoric sites. Its location beneath an urban neighborhood limits access for large-scale intervention. The soft coralline limestone from which it is carved is susceptible to chemical weathering and biological growth. The presence of red ochre paintings on the walls and ceiling means that any change in the atmospheric chemistry of the enclosed space can cause irreversible damage to art that has survived 5,000 years. The most significant threat is humidity. Human bodies produce both water vapor and carbon dioxide when breathing, and in an enclosed underground space with limited air exchange, even a modest number of visitors produces measurable increases in both. Water vapor raises the relative humidity of the air, which promotes the growth of microorganisms on stone surfaces and accelerates the dissolution of the calcium carbonate that constitutes the limestone walls. Carbon dioxide dissolves in water to form carbonic acid, which also attacks limestone chemically. The combined effect of visitor presence, even at low numbers, is a slow but real deterioration of the site. Heritage Malta responds to this challenge through strict visitor number limits, approximately 80 people per day in normal operation, and an atmospheric monitoring system that tracks temperature, humidity, and CO2 levels continuously. When atmospheric conditions in the Hypogeum approach thresholds that could cause damage, access is suspended until conditions return to safe levels. The site has been closed to visitors for extended periods in the past when atmospheric remediation was required. The daily visitor limit creates a tension that does not have a fully satisfying resolution. The Hypogeum is a UNESCO World Heritage Site and one of the most significant prehistoric monuments in Europe. The demand for access substantially exceeds what can be accommodated without risk to the site's integrity. Tickets are allocated months in advance. Many people who would like to visit never get the opportunity. The site exists in its most complete form when it is not visited at all, and is accessible to the public only at the cost of its own slow deterioration. The Hal Saflieni Hypogeum asks a question that cuts across the disciplines that have studied it. How much did the people who built it understand about what they were building? The physical achievement is documented. An underground complex of considerable architectural sophistication, carved without metal tools, maintained and expanded over 1,000 years, designed with visual and spatial references to the above-ground sacred architecture of the same culture. The acoustic achievement is measured. A specific chamber with a specific resonant frequency that produces specific, documented effects on human brain activity. The gap between those two documented facts, construction and acoustic effect, is the space where interpretation must operate. The Neolithic builders of Malta did not have a theory of acoustics. They did not know about Hertz frequencies or left prefrontal cortex suppression. What they had was experience. Experience of how sounds felt in the spaces they were carving, transmitted through the bodies of practitioners who used those spaces for ritual purposes and adjusted the design in response to what they experienced. That kind of embodied knowledge, learning through repeated practice what a space does to a person, is not less sophisticated than theoretical knowledge. It is differently organized, and it does not leave the same kind of documentary record, but it can produce the same outcomes. The Hypogeum's acoustic properties are the strongest case yet identified for the argument that prehistoric people were engaged in deliberate acoustic engineering, shaping spaces not just for visual or structural effect, but for their sonic and therefore psychological impact on those who used them. Whether this was a general practice or specific to particular cultures and sites remains to be established by the ongoing work in archaeoacoustics. But the Hypogeum is the anchor case, the site where the evidence is clearest, the measurements most reproducible, and the architectural intentionality most difficult to explain away as coincidence. 5,000 years after the last person was buried in the lower chambers and the entrance was sealed, the oracle chamber still resonates at 110 Hz when a voice is raised within it. Whatever it was originally designed to do, it still does it.